Why my dad's family wanted me dead at 5, my shocking childhood story. If you've never heard of me, let me introduce myself. My name's Rodney, well, officially, it's Rodney Balthazar. I was born on August 29, 1981, in Ullens, a quiet little suburb just outside Lyon, which happens to be the third largest city in France. My family left France in 1984 when I was just 3 years old. At the time, I couldn't speak a single word. We moved to the Republic of the Congo, most people know it as Congo-Brazzaville, to avoid confusion with its larger neighbor, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, further south and east. Back then, my inability to talk caused quite a stir. Some of my father's relatives decided I was mentally slow. They didn't just think it, they made sure I felt it. They bullied me relentlessly, mocking me for something I couldn't control. Things weren't any better on my biological mother's side of the family. Honestly, I don't even consider them part of my life anymore, and with good reason. They saw me as defective and treated me like some kind of burden. They tore me down mentally, beat me physically, and made sure I knew I didn't belong. In Moundely, the district of Brazzaville where we lived, even some of our neighbors, full-grown adults, mind you, joined in the cruelty. They laughed at me, ridiculed me for my speechlessness, and for struggling to learn basic things. My biological mother, Catherine, whose name still leaves a bad taste in my mouth, was no better. She was one of my biggest tormentors. She treated me like I was nothing more than a mistake, an accident she wished had never happened. And it wasn't just her, some of her family openly said they hoped I'd never amount to anything. Their words weren't just cruel, they were venomous, the kind of talk that stays with you. It got so bad that a few of my father's relatives suggested that I'd be better off dead. They told him outright that I should just be hit by a car or a truck and buried in the Atatalo cemetery. Can you imagine? Grown adults saying that about a child, a 5-year-old, no less. My father, Andre, was furious. He fought with some of them, and honestly, I'm grateful he did. But those moments planted a deep resentment in me. I began to question the very culture I was growing up in. Why is it that we, as black people, tolerate such cruelty within our communities? Why do we excuse bullying, abuse, and neglect as if they're just part of the package? We let these things fester in our families, our tribes, our societies, without ever holding people accountable. And don't even start with the colonialism excuses. I don't want to hear it. Nobody from Europe, the Middle East, or anywhere else is forcing black parents to treat their children like garbage. Nobody is holding a gun to a parent's head, demanding they beat their child senseless or humiliate them to the point of breaking. These are choices people make, and blaming history doesn't make it right. Sure, there's a difference between discipline and abuse. I'm not against spanking. My dad and my stepmom disciplined me when I messed up, and I learned from it. But what I can't stand is when parents treat their kids as scapegoats for their own failures. It's like they see their children as punching bags for all the frustration they've bottled up over the years. If you didn't want that child, why bring them into the world? Don't use your kids as a dumping ground for your regrets. It's not their fault you made choices based on what others wanted instead of living life on your own terms. Don't feed me this nonsense that we, as black people, weren't harsh with our kids back in pre-colonial times. Spare me the fairy tales. Our cultures and traditions have long placed the community's needs above the individual's, and while that sounds noble, it's also been a breeding ground for a lot of harmful practices. Shame has always been a tool we've used to enforce conformity. Planned marriages, forced marriages, they've been part of our history for centuries, and they still are in many places. Now, before anyone accuses me of dragging black culture or dissing Africa, let me just own it. I am calling out some of our so-called family values. And you know what? I plead guilty. Guilty of calling out the excuses we use to justify the ugly outcomes we've allowed to persist. Guilty of saying that many of us have forgotten that strong families are the backbone of a healthy society. Without them, what are we really building? Instead of fixing the flaws in our traditions, we prioritize saving face. We cling to broken systems, blaming everyone but ourselves for the mess we're in. Colonialism this, oppression that, when do we take responsibility? For instance, my uncles thought I should have been dead by the age of 5, dismissed as a retarded French reject. To this day, not one of them has apologized. Why? Because they're caregivers. And as an adult, I'm just supposed to accept that and show them respect? Give me a break. That's another issue we have in black majority communities, whether in Africa or anywhere else, this ridiculous idea that respect is automatic. Respect is earned, not handed out like candy at Halloween. If you're an aunt, uncle, or parent who abuses the younger members of your family, physically, emotionally, or otherwise, you don't deserve respect. You're just creating broken, angry people who carry that pain into adulthood. What do you think happens to those people? They spiral into cycles of crime, domestic violence, poverty, and self-destruction. I didn't even start speaking properly until I was 5 years old. Ironically, it was my middle sister, 3.5 years younger than me, who taught me how to talk. She was always chatty, and somehow, her words broke through the wall I couldn't climb on my own. But even then, people still mocked me. In Ouenz and Moungali, the districts of Brazzaville where we lived, I was just that mute kid, the French reject. School was no escape. Other kids bullied me constantly, even kids much older than me. There was one boy, 4 years my senior, who beat me up for no reason other than my existence. Catherine, my biological mother, and her family were no help. They doubled down on the bullying, treating me like a mistake that wouldn't go away. One memory still makes my stomach churn. I was in 3rd grade, 8 years old, at Bueda Mbongo Primary School. I was terrified of dogs, and still am to this day. There was this dog named Bobby, a red-bone coonhound mix from one of the neighbors' homes. Bobby used to terrorize me. One day, while playing behind the house we rented, Bobby came after me. I ran as fast as I could, screaming, but I didn't realize he was right on my heels. When I turned around and saw him chasing me, I panicked so much that I lost control and defecated in my shorts. When I got to school, the teacher sent me home in disgust. And when I arrived, Catherine didn't comfort me. She beat me instead. One of her sisters, Elizabeth, joined in, mocking me and even encouraging my younger sister to bully me about the incident. I was humiliated, called every horrible name in the book, all because I was scared of a dog. Looking back, I'm lucky the neighbor's daughter, Bobby's owner, intervened and stopped him from biting me. But Catherine didn't care. She yelled at me, made me feel small, and showed no empathy. On another day, still at 8 years old, I saw Bobby again. Terrified, I ran straight into the road, screaming, and almost got hit by a car. Neighbors called Catherine to let her know what happened, and when I got home, she beat me so badly that people had to step in and physically stop her. Some of the neighbors whispered that Catherine and her family must have wicked hearts, even calling them witches for how they treated me. And maybe they were right. I'll never forget how Catherine, the woman who gave birth to me, turned on me time and time again. She blamed me for her father's death back in France, as if I had anything to do with it. That's why I call her by her first name now, Catherine. Not Mom. Not anything that implies love or respect. She lost that right long ago. I made a decision as a child that I would no longer want her in my life, and to this day, I've stuck by it. Deep down, I always wondered why this kind of cruelty toward children seemed less common in places like France, Hungary, Portugal, or the United States. Why did we, as black people, find it socially acceptable to treat our kids so harshly? Why did so many of our elders refuse to take responsibility for their verbal abuse, physical violence, and neglect, hiding behind their status as the eldest? Don't try to tell me that cultures like Hungary or Japan don't deal with saving face, are you kidding? That's universal. But unlike us, they seem to handle it without using their children as emotional punching bags. To escape the trauma, I retreated into my own world. My dreams became my sanctuary, loyal companions who never abandoned or betrayed me. They were all I had when reality felt unbearable. When my father finally divorced Catherine, I felt like I could breathe for the first time. The day she left was one of the happiest days of my life. She was never a mother to me, and even if a DNA test revealed that she had ties to Hungary, Sweden, or anywhere else, I still wouldn't want her in my life. She and many of my father's relatives had made it clear they didn't want me around. They saw me as a burden, a retard they wished had never been born. But I do have a mother, my stepmother, Rose. She's been my rock through it all. Rose believed in me when others wrote me off, called me names, and doubted I'd ever amount to anything. She didn't give birth to me, but she's the only mother I've ever known. Rose is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and she's faced her own battles with prejudice. Some of my father's cousins mistreated her just because she wasn't from the Republic of the Congo. There's a lot of tension and outright racism between the two nations, and Rose bore the brunt of it. Rose always told me, family isn't just about blood. Raising a child is far harder than giving birth to one. She was right. True family are the ones who stand by you, guide you, and help you grow, no matter the obstacles. My stepmother and her siblings defended me fiercely. They couldn't stand the way some of my father's relatives treated me, calling me names like spastic moron and dirtface. It hurt them to see me endure that. Dad, for his part, stood by me too. He became furious with his family's behavior, especially when they reminded me that I wasn't truly Congolese. That was their favorite jab: the Republic of the Congo isn't your country. You're French, and you'd better focus on your education so you can go back to France someday and join the military. Looking back, it's almost laughable. Almost. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, I want you to know this: someone else's cruel words don't define you. Their hateful perceptions are not your truth. You didn't ask to be here, but you are, and you have so much to offer this world. No one has the right to rob you of your childhood or your dignity. And remember this: no one is untouchable. Even if the law doesn't hold people accountable for their wickedness, life has a way of evening the score. Speak out. Don't suffer in silence. We all know what happens when people ignore cruelty: it spreads. Bullying has no place in schools, families, workplaces, or anywhere else. Period. It's on all of us to call it out and shut it down. Thank you for taking the time to hear my story. Today, I'm proud to be a writer, sharing my experiences and lessons in the hope that they bring value to others. I'm also grateful to pay taxes in the United States as a foreign resident, something I never thought I'd be able to say. It's because of people like you, who believe in stories like mine, that I've made it this far. So please, whoever you are, wherever you come from, and whoever you love, don't let anyone make you feel unwanted. Don't give them the satisfaction. Too many people who've endured abuse, neglect, and discrimination have felt the pull of suicide, thinking it's the only way out. I was one of them. By age 12, I had already begun wrestling with those dark thoughts. Some couldn't resist the pull, and they're no longer here. My heart aches for them and their families. But if you're reading this, know that your survival is an act of defiance. Don't let your enemies win by leaving this world on their terms. You're stronger than that, and you're worth so much more. Second story. Why laziness is a myth. I've been teaching psychology since back in 2012. Over the past 6 years, I've seen students of all kinds avoid writing their papers until the last second, skip their big presentation days, blow off assignments, and let deadlines come and go like they don't exist. Some of the most promising grad school hopefuls have missed out on their dreams just because they couldn't get their applications turned in on time. I've watched PhD students drag out revisions on a single draft for months, sometimes even years. There was even this one guy who signed up for my class 2 semesters in a row and still didn't hand in a single piece of work. But you know what? I've never thought laziness was the issue. Not once. In fact, I don't even think laziness is real. As a social psychologist, I've always been fascinated by the way people's actions are shaped by their circumstances. If you want to figure out why someone acts the way they do, you're usually better off looking at the situation they're in rather than their personality, IQ, or some other individual trait. The environment matters more than most people realize. So, when one of my students starts missing deadlines, skips out on assignments, or struggles in other parts of their life, I don't jump to conclusions about their character. Instead, I ask myself, what's going on around them? What basic needs aren't being met? And when it comes to behavior people love to call lazy, I always wonder, what invisible obstacles are standing in their way? Because there's always something. Always. And the first step to breaking that so-called lazy pattern is recognizing those barriers and treating them as legitimate challenges, not personal failings. I've learned that responding to someone's struggles with curiosity instead of judgment can make all the difference. This is something I picked up from my friend Kimberly Larson, a writer and activist who goes by the pen name Mick Everett. Kim has spent years fighting for the rights of disabled and homeless people, and their work has completely changed how I view these issues. They write with this incredible combination of brilliance and personal experience, having lived through both homelessness and disability themselves. Kim opened my eyes to just how misguided it is to judge a homeless person for buying alcohol or cigarettes. When you're homeless, everything about your life is uncomfortable. The nights are freezing, the world feels hostile, and even getting a little sleep can be next to impossible. Whether you're sleeping under a bridge, in a tent, or in a shelter, it's a constant battle. You're likely dealing with pain, maybe an injury, maybe a chronic illness, and you probably don't have access to a doctor or healthy food. In that context, wanting a drink or a smoke just makes sense. Kim once explained to me that when you're shivering in the cold, alcohol might be the only thing that helps you feel warm enough to sleep. And if you haven't eaten properly in days, a cigarette can dull those hunger pains just enough to keep you going. If you're also trying to cope with addiction, then sometimes you need whatever will stop the withdrawal symptoms just to survive. Most people don't see it that way. They'd rather judge. It's easier to blame homeless people for their choices than to admit how brutal their circumstances are. It lets people feel better about the injustice in the world. But here's the thing, unless you've walked in someone's shoes, unless you know what their life really feels like, you'll never understand the choices they make. It's easy to sit in judgment and say things like, homeless people should stop drinking and go get a job. But how can they do that when they're exhausted, malnourished, and battling illnesses they can't treat? Kim taught me this: if someone's behavior doesn't make sense to you, it's because you don't know enough about their situation. That lesson has stuck with me, and now I see it everywhere. I apply it to all kinds of situations where people's struggles are written off as laziness or moral failure. And every time, I find that the real story is much more complicated and far more human. Take procrastination, for example. People love to shame procrastinators, as if putting something off is a sign of weakness or laziness. Even procrastinators themselves often believe that lie. You're supposed to be working, but you're not, so clearly, you're just not motivated enough, right? Wrong. For decades, research has shown that procrastination isn't about laziness, it's about problems with functioning. Most of the time, it boils down to either A, being so anxious about doing a good job that you can't even start, or B, feeling overwhelmed because you don't know how to take the first step. And ironically, the more you care about the task, the more likely you are to procrastinate. If you're terrified of failing or don't know how to tackle something big and complicated, it's no wonder you freeze up. When that happens, sitting in front of your work and beating yourself up about it doesn't help. If anything, it makes things worse. The guilt and stress build up, and starting feels even harder. What really helps is stepping back and identifying what's blocking you. If it's anxiety, you might actually need to take a break and do something relaxing before you can get back to work. If it's confusion, then breaking the task into smaller, more manageable steps is the way forward. Let me give you an example. I managed to complete my dissertation in just over a year, a process that takes some people much longer. The reason I could move so quickly wasn't because I'm brilliant or disciplined, it's because I had a clear plan. I broke the project into small, specific tasks, gathering research, outlining the paper, scheduling time to write, and tackling one section at a time. It wasn't magic. It was just a matter of knowing where to start and how to keep going. Breaking tasks into manageable steps has always come naturally to me. It's just how my analytical, hyper-focused brain works, thanks, in part, to my being on the autism spectrum. I never needed anyone to teach me how to structure my workload or stick to a schedule. But I realize that's not the case for most people. Many folks need external systems to keep them on track, things like a weekly writing group with friends or a clear schedule set by someone else. When they're tackling a big project, they often need help breaking it down into smaller, actionable steps, along with a realistic timeline to complete them. Tools like calendars, to-do lists, and syllabi aren't crutches, they're essential resources. Needing structure doesn't mean someone's lazy, it means they're human. And the sooner we accept that, the better we can help people thrive. I'll never forget one student of mine who had trouble making it to class. Sometimes I'd catch her lingering near the building, looking completely drained, only to disappear once class started. When she did come to class, she sat quietly in the back, her eyes fixed on the desk, her energy almost non-existent. During small group discussions, she'd contribute a little, but she never spoke up in front of the entire class. To most professors, she probably looked like someone who didn't care, lazy, disorganized, or disengaged. I know that's how some of my colleagues talk about students who underperform. There's often this simmering resentment, like, why doesn't this student take my class seriously? Why won't they validate my brilliance by putting in the effort? But my class had a unit on mental health stigma, which is a subject close to my heart. As someone who's neurodivergent and a psychologist, I've seen firsthand how unfair our field can be to people like me. During that unit, we discussed how society misinterprets mental illness, how depression gets dismissed as laziness, mood swings are labeled manipulative, and severe conditions are seen as incompetence or even danger. That quiet student listened intently during this discussion. As the room emptied out after class, she stayed behind. She looked nervous, but she approached me and opened up about her struggles. She explained that she had a mental illness and was actively seeking treatment. Therapy sessions, switching medications, and dealing with side effects were all part of her daily reality. She admitted that sometimes she couldn't make it out of the house or sit still in a classroom for hours. She hadn't told her other professors, fearing they'd think she was using her illness as an excuse. But she trusted me to understand. And I did. But I was furious that she'd been made to feel ashamed for symptoms she couldn't control. Here was someone balancing a full course load, a part-time job, and intensive mental health treatment. She was self-aware, proactive, and doing everything she could to manage her life. She wasn't lazy, she was a damn hero. I told her as much. She took more classes with me over the years, and I watched her gradually blossom. By her junior and senior years, she was actively participating in class discussions, challenging me with thoughtful questions, and even sharing her experiences with mental illness openly. She became a leader in class, bringing in examples from the news and media to spark conversations about psychological concepts. When she needed a day off, she'd let me know, and I'd accommodate her. While some of my colleagues, yes, even in the psychology department, remained judgmental, she thrived in an environment where her challenges were recognized and respected. And she wasn't the only one. There was the young man with OCD who was often late because his compulsions delayed him. The survivor of an abusive relationship who had therapy sessions scheduled right before my class. The woman who had been assaulted by a peer and had to endure classes with her assailant while the school's investigation dragged on. These students came to me because I created a space where their struggles were acknowledged without judgment. With just a little understanding and accommodation, they flourished. They tackled assignments that had once seemed insurmountable, raised their grades, and began considering opportunities like graduate school and internships. But not all professors saw things this way. One of my colleagues was infamous for her rigidity. No makeup exams, no late arrivals, no excuses ever. To her, any barrier a student faced was irrelevant. As a result, students in her class struggled, shamed into silence about their mental health issues, trauma, or disabilities. She even grew suspicious when students who performed poorly in her classes excelled in mine. The hypocrisy enraged me. How could someone in our field, someone trained to understand human behavior, be so dismissive of the challenges students faced? It's a cruelty that masquerades as academic rigor, and it's morally indefensible. Of course, I know most educators aren't trained to consider the unseen barriers in their students' lives. Many universities even pride themselves on refusing accommodations, confusing harshness with high standards. And most professors are people who thrived in academia without needing much support, so they struggle to empathize with students who face executive dysfunction, sensory overload, or mental health crises. But just as no one chooses to be lazy, no one chooses to be ignorant. These judgmental attitudes come from a lack of understanding, and that's why I'm writing this. I want my fellow educators, and anyone who's quick to label others as lazy or irresponsible, to pause and consider this. If someone isn't meeting expectations, there's always a reason. If someone can't get out of bed, they're exhausted. If a student isn't writing papers, something about the assignment is too daunting. If an employee keeps missing deadlines, they're struggling with organization or stress. Even when someone's choices seem self-sabotaging, there's always an explanation, some unmet need, some fear or doubt, some invisible barrier. No one wants to feel like a failure. No one enjoys being ineffective or unmotivated. If you see laziness, look closer. You're missing the full picture. There's always more to the story. You might not have been able to view people this way before, and that's okay. But now you can. So give it a shot.